Hi, my name's Mark Kingsnorth. Thank you to Blender London for having me. I'm going to talk today about my work in Blender. I've been developing add-ons for the last couple of years. I'm going to talk about some of my inspiration for those add-ons and how my time as a software engineer as well has helped me. So I'll get into that now. So very briefly about me. By day, I'm a software engineer. That's how I describe myself, at least. I've been developing software for about 20 years now. I've worked on Java systems, Unix, and then I've done some web applications in JavaScript. I've written a bit of Python, particularly in Blender, actually. I've been in the realm of things like data analysis and data visualization for sectors like banking and security. And when I was writing that, I thought, well, that definitely sounds more impressive than it actually probably is on a day-to-day basis. It can be a bit tedious at times. So by night, I've always been fascinated by computer graphics. I've been a CG enthusiast before that time as a software developer, and I've got into Blender in recent years, mainly with a sci-fi twist, and I'll go into first of all some of my childhood obsessions that led to this work. So for me, it all started with something called the MUTARA Nebula, which is in a little known sci-fi series called Star Trek. It was in Star Trek 2. It was towards the end in the big battle between Kirk and Khan. And I remember, and I'm betraying my age a little here, I was probably about 6 or 7 at the time, looking at that effect of the nebula and thinking, how did they do that? How did they make that effect? And later on, I think I remember seeing a documentary where they actually they filled a massive tank with water and paint, and they mixed salt water and fresh water together, and that created all sorts of interesting cloud effects. And then they actually filmed that effect. And I dug out a link that describes it a bit more. I can share it later on if anybody's interested. That was I was just absolutely fascinated by how that effect was done. So I was quite young at the time, and looking back, it was quite a bit of an obsession. And I thought it was okay for a couple of years, and then I got into computer graphics. Computer gaming on the Amiga, and I got there was a particular game called Alien Breed. And on the first level they had this really cool spaceship, like fighter jet, and because it was only like a 2D top-down shooter, I could only see it from the top, and I kept thinking, like, how does that look from certain angles, you know? And I kind of for the conference I kind of recreated the sketch I remember making at the time, trying to work out techniques. This was before I knew there were kind of orthographic projections and those sorts of things, to work out like what that ship might look like from the side. And again, this was a bit of an obsession I had for a while, but I was okay until I kind of got into Star Trek even more. I was fascinated by some of the modeling work and the starships in Star Trek: The Next Generation. There was a model starship called the Nebula class starship, funnily enough, which there weren't any diagrams I could find online at the time. I was probably in my teenage years at the time, so I kind of made my own. I found this on the internet. I don't think it's mine, but it was definitely something similar to that. I also got into this is when I got into 3D, really. I found a program called True Space 2, which some of you may remember. Again, I'm showing my age a bit as well, where I made this 3D model. And I can't find the 3D model anymore, I'm afraid. And I remember being quite impressed with it at the time, but it probably doesn't hold up to much scrutiny now. That's how it started. But after that, I felt like I had to grow up a bit and look at getting a proper job. And a lot of the people I talked to at the time, I mean, you got to remember this is kind of when CG and stuff was in its relative infancy. Things like Toy Story had just come out, and people really didn't sort of advise me to take a career path down this route. But what it had got me into is things like software engineering and using tools and things to develop websites. So I did a computer science degree, I was a software engineer by day, but I did start taking night classes in 3D Studio Max to kind of get my modeling skills a bit better. And that's when I think I was in my 20s then. I started doing things for fan productions, making Starship models, and these are some of the ones that I made at the time. But I had a few issues, as we might call it. It was a very time-consuming hobby to have, as I'm sure a lot of you know. So the first problem I remember having was there was one fan production I was working for where the design of the spaceship kept going back and forth, and they were like, "Yeah, that looks great, but could we add more windows?" And I was modelling the windows at the time. I was extruding them and things, and it would just take me forever to make these windows. And I'd add a few, they'd ask for more, and I'd have to, and it was taking me hours and hours and hours. And it was, I kept thinking, surely there must be a better way of doing this. And this was also extended to some of the detailing I'd add on the spaceships. A lot of the plating details would just take me forever. Modeling the overall shape would probably take me a few days, if that. But then adding all those little intricate details, those greebles, as some people call them, would just take forever. So then I started getting into Blender a bit more a few years ago, and I was initially attracted by the volumetric effects I started seeing. I think they were sort of first being released in Blender a few years ago, and it kind of took me back to that kind of childhood obsession of how can I create like that cool nebula effect I saw in Star Trek, and these are some of my early experiments that I've screenshotted here. They were okay, but they were definitely closer than I'd ever realized. I had this childhood dream of recreating the effect myself without a big tank. You can see like the colors were very similar to the MUTARA Nebula that I'd seen in Star Trek. And so I started like kind of trying to take that approach of like having like basic shapes like spheres and cubes and playing with the density controls to create those volumetric effects. So with Blender as well, I discovered the node system as well in cycles, that really interested me as well, because I at the time was quite obsessed by a lot of Photoshop tutorials that created a lot of impressive nebula effects. There was one tutorial I've checked, it's still around actually, it's on DeviantArt, I've got the link down there, that went through like a Photoshop 2D process of creating a nebula effect. And it was a really impressive effect, but as you know, in Photoshop and GIMP, it has this concept of layers that you build on top of each other, and you overlay certain effects like screen effects and overlay effects to brighten parts of the picture and whatnot. The problem there obviously is that it's kind of, once you've done the effect, you can't kind of go back and tweak it. And I started thinking about what I'd seen in cycles, and I thought, well, actually, I could create perhaps a node system that's quite dynamic and can kind of change the effect rather quickly. So the beauty of, I hope you can see that animation a little bit, that it was the node system allowed me to kind of put these layered effects on top of one another, but then tweak just little parameters in the noise or the scale of the noise, and just very quickly create all sorts of effects that I found impressive, that I dreamed of as a kid. So I was really happy with that. So being a software engineer, I kind of, I packaged this up into something as sort of as generally configurable as possible, and it became the Nebula generator. And I put it on Blender Market. It became quite popular. Certainly popular enough for me to invest more time in it, to justify the time I was spending, and I also created a 3D version. So I'll just give you a quick demo of that now, if I can, if it will allow me. So can you see that okay? Hello?
Yes, I can see that. Yeah.
Okay. So the first version I developed was like a 2D version, and you can see the node group is a bit sophisticated, but it basically overlays lots of noise effects on top of each other, and by tweaking a few parameters, you can quickly change the effect. You can kind of do things like tweak the colors and pan around. And for me, that was just an amazing thing that I'd never been able to recreate before in all the other programs that I played with over the years. And then last year, when Eevee came about, I created a where is it? A 3D version, and this is an Eevee. And this, you can kind of see it's on the default cube here. It kind of recreates that idea, I suppose, of having that sort of big water tank with different densities in it to give it different effects. And amazingly, it's a lot simpler than the 2D version in a way, in terms of all the nodes set up. So you can do things like so you can move around, you can pan around the scene. It's a relatively low resolution at the moment. You can ramp that up a bit, but I won't try and break my computer while I'm demoing it. You can do things like change the scale of the effect, and the colors and those sorts of things. And yeah, so it's something that I just dreamt of doing for years, really. So I was really happy with that. So onto that kind of plating detailing on models. Again, I kept thinking, well, surely there's a way I can kind of speed this up. And with my software engineering background, I kept thinking, well, surely I can create a tool, maybe, around speeding up. There's lots of like good tutorials as well online about kind of how to create these effects, but I found them quite time consuming. So I discovered the Blender Python API. And I didn't know a lot of Python at the time. It's worth saying, but coding is kind of like, once you've learned one language, you can kind of apply it to a lot of different things. The syntax, as they call it, is a little different. The way they word things, and but it's something you can pick up once you've learned one thing. So I created a tool. Again, I thought, well, how would I want to use it? And based on like face selections, I created this add-on that creates different plating effects. You can also add like little greeble type effects that they call, like little detailing quite quickly, and sort of things that would have taken me forever previously. Blender speeded up no end. So this became the plating generator. Very, very briefly, and also this brings me on to another subject. I'll show you a quick demo of a simple scene here. So you'll see that this is actually, although it's a traditional kind of operators, they call it in Blender, you can use it as a modeling tool. In the last 6 months, I added a feature where you can also use this in animation nodes for people who know that. So it's kind of like one of Blender's fledgling node type systems out there. It's more for animation, but I found it extensible enough that I could write some code in it. So here, so the tool here, so by just changing like a random seed value, you can kind of quickly cycle through sort of different effects. So if I go over to the donut, you can do things like change the heights and sort of get sort of really kind of, interesting effects fairly quickly. This is where I've started exploring as well, this node system, or this kind of like procedural modeling workflow, where, because a lot of the requests I got from the users of the tool was like, could they kind of make it more interactive, so like not make it just what you apply the effect and then you walk away. So so that was the placing generator. I thought I'd just spend a few moments talking about some of the lessons learned that I got from putting my add-ons on Blender Market, because I'd never kind of done anything like that before. So the first thing I'd say, and a few life lessons as well, actually. So from Blender Market, I suppose I treated myself as like my first customer, and I was quite lucky that I suppose I was operating in a world that I was interested in, I was keen on. I kind of know how some of the tools would work, or how I'd like the tools to work. I kind of took it used that as a starting point, I suppose. I'd also say kind of advertising is key, kind of unfortunately, really. I think not just in Blender, but in kind of all walks of life, you can create the most amazing thing. But like if nobody knows about it, then nobody's going to be interested in it or download it. I probably spend about 40 to 50% of my time coding when I'm making an add-on, and probably the 50% of the time I'm doing documentation, I'm doing some videos, I'm tweeting about it and those sorts of things. So it kind of comes with the territory, really. I try and respond to customers as quickly as possible, because some people are on deadlines as well. So I always try and sort of, when an email comes through, I try and act on it. At the outside, I try and act within at least a couple of days. I also kind of work hard to try and understand what people want, especially kind of your more critical users. Are actually some of the most valuable, because they'll, through talking to them, really understanding what they're after, I find come up with features that I never thought I would have done before. Definitely, as I said, spend time in documentation, and videos do speak 1,000 words. I can't emphasize that enough. So you can probably tell that I don't find this sort of thing the most natural thing to do, things like videos. I do find them the hardest bit of my work in this world, and that's why I've actually kind of recruited my wife recently. And if you listen to my YouTube channel, a lot of the videos are actually voiced over by my wife to save me some of the stresses. So briefly as well in life, there was a couple of quotes that came to mind. There's a quote, I think it's from a very grown-up author, but I actually found it from The Walking Dead, where they said, someday all this will be useful to you. So kind of going back to that software engineering thing, I kind of always struggled in my main career, like had this friction between this is a hobby and how can, and my sort of main career is software engineering. But what I've actually found is like all my experiences in software engineering that aren't really a hobby, I've actually applied to working in Blender and creating add-ons. So it's all been really useful to me that I've been able to apply that experience. And another kind of quote from Breaking Bad, from Walter White. I'm not saying like, to push drugs or anything, but, I think like, I did all this, having this enthusiasm has kind of pushed me along as well. I did it for me, as Heisenberg says, I felt good, and I felt, and I felt really alive. And I thought, a couple of years ago when I was trying to make this work a bit more, I realized that I was enjoying it. And that's an important part of your life. You've got to do something you enjoy. So what next for Blender. So I think, as I mentioned before, things like nodes and proceduralism and non-destructive workflows. I think hopefully we're going to see a lot more of that. I've mentioned animation nodes, which is a freely available framework. There's things like Sawcar I've looked at, which is a great start, I think. I've heard lots of about everything nodes. I'm kind of watching some of the development tickets with anticipation there. I've done a bit of experiment myself with other tools like Houdini to kind of explore that procedural workflow more. I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if it comes up. Other things I've seen, like, so many of you have seen The Mandalorian. I watched some of the making of videos there, and I was fascinated by the LED screen technology they're using there, to, instead of green screens, to kind of so that the actors can kind of feel a lot more immersed in their environment. And what that seems to be using is some real-time game rendering engines. So I think I'm interested in where Eevee might go in that space as well. I think that's going to be really interesting. A few personal pleas about Blender. I think like making the modifier API extensible. I've asked this before, and but like I think if that was like an extendable part that people could write Python plugins in, I think that would be really powerful to have that in that modifier stack in Blender. Because the one thing I kind of miss from 3D Studio Max is funnily enough the edit poly modifier, so you could kind of put editable steps in your modifier stack, so that you could kind of go back and forth through that. And I can't find the equivalent in Blender. I kind of miss that, but it's probably not worth paying 2,000 or so for. And any performance improvements on the Blender API, I mean, it's great, it's fast at the moment, but any making it faster would always be good. So, and I'll just show you on that procedural topic. I'll just show you another add-on that I've developed. Well, it's actually a bundle of my existing add-ons. So a combination of mainly the shape generator, which generates lots of 3D random shapes, and the plating generator from earlier. And this is actually not released yet. This is kind of like an Eevee version of combining those two concepts, so that you can kind of quickly create random shapes, kind of well, for me, they're kind of spaceship shapes, but I've left them as generic shapes, and you can kind of see, you know, in Eevee, there's lots of kind of plating effects that are going on here. You know, and I've put things like a lattice on it, so that you can do things like change the proportions really quickly. So you know, that sort of thing. I better wrap it up because I'm running out of time. So what next for me? So yeah, more tutorials. I think more tutorial videos on some of the tools I'm using and developing. I'm probably going to recruit my wife more and more to do those sorts of things. I want to do kind of more actual kind of end-to-end graphics. Definitely some more add-ons I've got ideas for. I've started some experimentation, as I mentioned, in tools like Houdini and Unity to kind of like see what's kind of around Blender in this space. Substance Painter as well. And that's all from me, really. So you can find me on Twitter. I tweet a lot about what I'm doing at any given time. I've got a YouTube channel, and of course I'm on Blender Market. You can see all the add-ons I've been developing on there. And that's me.